Our next group of speakers, if I can have you join us, Dr. Guggenheim, Alex, Martin, Averill, Clary, Kira, you're not going anywhere. And I don't know, is Kashan? There he is. Yes, sir. You could all join us up here. We'll get ready for the next panel. He's standing. I'm leaving the dais and he's standing. No. We got enough seats, I think.
Anything you want.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. What I'd like to do is just kind of set the stage for this. We've been talking, Doug Parsons is a podcaster, infamous podcaster in the climate adaptation sphere, but he also has had the opportunity to talk to a number of our speakers, interview them a bit, and has also been here listening for the last couple of days. What we like to do at the end of these conferences is basically to do kind of observations. You know, a lot of our speakers have also been here hearing what others had to say. And we like to kind of get those subject matter experts to interact with each other. So one of the things that Doug brings to the table is a strong background in environmental issues, knowledgeable about that, and we've educated him about preservation. I drag him to these things sometimes, and I send him off to other people who have historic sites to do podcasts with them. So that said, I'm going to turn this over to Doug Parsons, and we will have a panel discussion. And I enjoy all the time you guys are spending with us. Thank you very much. We will have time for some questions. He'll make sure to allow for that. Thanks.
This is quite low for Lisa. I better put it up here. Hi, everyone. Thank you. And first of all, I want to thank the organizers of this conference and the people here in Trinidad and Tobago. You guys have been fantastic. It's just been a wonderful experience. I'll be looking at some of my questions on here. I've moderated a lot of panels, and I want to set some ground rules. Look at the size of this panel here. I mean, my gosh, okay? And we got to factor that in. But this is the end of the day. Last session, except for the wrap-up. So could I have the organizers please lock the doors from the outside, and we'll go from there. Just some ground rules for the panel. I'm not going to introduce them or give them any background. They can just say their name again and say where they work, just so we can have a reminder. You've probably seen most of them present. I'll start off with some questions. I do hope to open this up to questions from you guys. We'll see. I have some questions, and we'll see. I'm going to kind of see if we can just go down the line, but if it naturally dies and not everyone wants to answer it, oh, that was a dumb question, Doug, then we're going to do that. Or if one of you on the panel feels so inspired, you've been thinking about this conference and you want to ask the rest of the panel a question, by all means, this is a very fluid thing. Again, and I'm talking too much myself, there's a lot of people here. Ask the panelists when you're answering a question, just be sensitive that there's other people on the panel that need to answer it too. The woman who was at the cocktail hour playing the steel pan, if you go on too long, I'll signal her to start playing the steel pan that you need to stop. So if you hear that, let's just move on, okay? And for when we get to the questions for the audience, please ask a question. Thank you. All right, let's get started. And thanks again. And again, introduce yourself, guys. I'm just going to go down the line here. And I'm just more of a, I do climate communication. I have a podcast. I'm sure you're all listeners. And this is important to me, and I want to hear your own experiences. Can you tell us some of your own successful efforts at communicating what's happening here, and I mean at this conference and what we're keeping history above water, to policymakers and the public? Maybe you don't have successful efforts. That in itself is useful information. David, you do a lot of communicating. Let's start with you.
David Guggenheim. Can you hear me? Okay. This is new in my repertoire. I think this conference, at first glance, is cultural heritage versus Mother Nature. And I think we're finding out, and my growing message is that natural heritage can also be a profound benefit to cultural heritage. And in fact, heritage is both natural and cultural. And I think there are important synergies here that we're just starting to talk about and starting to realize. And working together, building awareness of these synergies, I think is critically important. And at a totally practical and selfish level, I've started planting seeds about funding opportunities to join forces in a more meaningful way to explore these synergies, and so that we can really join forces and help educate the world and do something about these challenges. Was that short enough?
Yeah, all right, go.
I know, I
Moving
was
on.
chatty.
Perfect.
Thank you. Kishan Kumar Singh. Maybe I could briefly give my own personal history on this. I started following climate change when I was about 22 years old, not long ago. 2-3 years, yes. And it was a hobby at that time because I was a scientific person, a kind of science buff. And then I started to read about it. I actually published my first article on climate change in 1993 when I was at the IMA. At that time, the issue of climate change was something abstract. It was something up in the air, out there, not really crystallizing in people's minds and so on. And then I started formally working on climate change, and then it was a huge challenge trying to get stakeholders to give data, to talk about it. And so for the better part of 15 to 20 years, that was the scenario. It was not in front of them. They didn't see it, out of sight, out of mind. It wasn't like litter. And it was only as recently as perhaps with the advent of the lead up to the Paris Agreement that this thing started to crystallize in the minds of the ordinary citizen. And that was because of our relentless effort to engage with everyone, policymakers, NGOs, academia. We started a climate change impact management course at the UWI in 2000, after realizing that this had to be a sustained capacity building effort. And so what we did, and perhaps could be tagged as a success story, is that we developed what was called, or is called, a national climate change focal point network, which now enjoys the participation of in excess of 250 agencies, NGOs, trade unions, fiduciary organizations, financial institutions, where we exchange ideas on climate change. And I think the success of that has to be largely due to the fact that climate change was not something, as I said, in front of you. But the more you explored it and the more information came out, you realize that climate change basically will not leave anyone unscathed or anything unscathed, from socio-economic systems, human systems, to the biophysical systems. And I think the more you thought about it, because it was new to everyone, the more linkages you made with life as we know it. And I made the link yesterday on climate change and national security and crime, which was not necessarily something that you would think about, off the cuff as an obvious link. So I think, the National Focal Point Network and the engaging stakeholders to share their own ideas, their own experiences, is something that I think has worked. And I should say that paradigm has been copied in other islands to engage stakeholders to actually get the national conversation going, if that helps. Thank you.
Oh, I have one. I think that's yours. I want to say that I believe that communication is really a two-way street. And as much as we may love to talk. The flip side of that is the listening that happens. My first experience with climate change was actually the very first month of my very first job as an architect out of school. It was in 1999, Hurricane Floyd in North Carolina and Virginia. And we were the Main Street architects, and we went and worked with the community in post-disaster. And I hadn't experienced it. I wasn't there to say, this is what I know. It was about listening. And I think the communicative aspect of that is taking the stories of the people and their experiences, much like Kim presented some quotes today. People's stories are incredibly powerful. And I find often that taking those stories to policymakers, decision makers, and also asking the policy and decision makers themselves what their stories are. You know, they don't often get asked about their experiences. They're just expected to take everybody's information and use it to make the decision as well. So I think what you do, Doug, is really important for podcasting and thinking about getting people's stories out there as well.
So I would say my introduction to climate change and communicating it is this project. Working with the National Trust on this project, we had to think of we actually have a communication plan. Your podcast is included in that, the social media, the media itself, the TV, the radio, newspapers, etc. The focus groups, the interaction with, we've had some one-on-one interviews, all of these things. So this project has been my full introduction to climate change. So I can't say I have experience beyond that.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Johnny come lately and last joining this group, and thank you very much to the National Trust for including me. I'm wearing two hats today. Throughout this conference, my name is Avril Balfon, and I'm the Government Archivist of Trinidad and Tobago, but I'm also the president of CABICA, which is the Caribbean branch of the International Council on Archives. And in a sense, if we're talking about a success story, this is, that's the one I'm going to point. In that hat is what I'm going to talk about. In 2018, can't say it was so much a climate change story. I think one of the presenters, I believe it was you mentioned, at the beginning, we're doing climate change mitigation and adaptation, so we don't know it's climate change at that time. But so in 2018, following the disastrous 2017 hurricane season of Irma and Maria and all of those, we got together a group of our colleagues, archivists, look, Jay was there as well, so we had archaeologists, we had librarians, people from the museums, and we just felt we needed to do something. It was so terrible after 2017. We just said, well, what could we do? And when you think about us as archivists, we're a really tiny group of people in the region, but we met and we said we're going to just call everybody together who comes, and we are having a brainstorming session about what can we do to help ourselves. And out of that meeting, we had a commitment for the formation of what we call the Caribbean Heritage Emergency Network. And it's alive. and we started a database of colleagues, professionals who were willing to respond if and when there is an emergency, and even before, to help with training, for institutional strengthening throughout the region in whatever field. So anybody who was willing to volunteer said, well, if something happens, call on me, I'm willing to join the team. And the lady who spoke from the Smithsonian, her program Heart on the Road, well, we had a Heart on the Road, we didn't even know. And so we had a member from the Smithsonian with us, and we did that same training in St. Martin, and we did one online. And so that was what I would consider my introduction to climate change, as I said, not even knowing that is, we were mitigating, we were planning, we were putting things in place to treat with the effects it had on us, and not just as archivists, but of course, as I said, all heritage professionals. And just to say, we have a session coming up just now in about a month, and hopefully we will be replicating, well, it is actually the follow-up to that meeting, and we hope to bring together that team to solidify that group. So the Caribbean Heritage Emergency Network, I consider our success story. Thank you. Sorry? Oh.
Tell us the dates.
Oh, sorry, I'm not good with advertising. All right, so April 26th to the 29th, God willing, cross fingers. And I can't say it.
In Trinidad.
In Trinidad and Tobago, yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Please excuse my having made notes. I'm quite far down this line, and I was worried about forgetting the question. Those of you who heard my presentation will have heard that we're often in the business of taking something that's worked in one place and trying to make it work somewhere else. And if we're thinking about advocacy, one of the things that has taught us is that if you're advocating, I would assume, towards government, different governments are in a different stage of readiness to listen to concerns about climate change. It's been quite heartening here in Trinidad and Tobago to see how ready the Trinidad and Tobago, I can't say the word, Trinbagonian, thank you, government is ready to have that conversation. So congratulations to all of you for making that happen here. Sometimes they're less ready, and sometimes some of our partner organisations, member organisations, have needed to open that conversation. And that's really what advocacy comes back to. Listen to us. We have something that's important to us that needs to be heard. It brings me back, in terms of what's successful, to the person-centred value of heritage. Ultimately, nobody really... Is that stopped? Hello, yes. Nobody... If we think about the case study in the Rwenzori Mountains with the Bakonzo people in the west of Uganda, it's very difficult to think about that as an abstract. But as soon as you're talking about it from the value of what it means to people, that's where you get people to sit up and take notice. So we had a documentary about that, just a 15-minute thing, which has been hugely successful and reached an enormous audience. It's because it starts from a person-centered perspective. If we think about the value of our buildings and our built heritage, I would argue that the same is true. If you're talking about why that building means something to someone, then you're going to get somewhere. But if you're just talking about its architectural values or its important history in a vacuum of what that means to people today, then you're on a hiding to nothing, as we would say. Thank you.
So one of the, hello, Martin Perschler, U.S. Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation. One of the other things that happens when you're at the end of the line is you not only lose track of the question, but everyone else gives your answer. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack on this and say that in terms of advocacy, I think my work is just beginning. In part because of what you said, Kara, this project, and I think I alluded to it in my presentation, this project has opened our eyes to the importance of moving planning or expecting planning at the beginning of any project that proposes to address the impacts of climate change. And as for measures of success, that is to be determined. We'll see how good an advocate I am when I go back to my office and say, we need to make this a policy when we review and select projects to support. Thank you.
Doug, I'm sorry, can I ask one quick question? Because going early, then you realized you forgot to say something, and I want to acknowledge the technology that's being used in this room to communicate as well. Sujin, Brent, Marty, you know, I mean, this is work that is really innovative and really technologically important, and visual communication is another method.
All right, thanks. Thanks for the reminder. I'll answer the question too. Start a podcast. So, tick. That was easy. All right, guys, that was the first round. You guys did pretty good. I didn't have to get the steel pan, so that's great. Here's the next question. I want to get through this too, and I'm going to start down there with you so you don't have to sit there and go, what was the question again? Okay, so we're going to do this. And just keep your answer to one word. If a young person wanted to be involved with, I'm kidding, okay? If a young person wanted to be involved with keeping history above water, meaning everything that we're doing here in adaptation and resilience, what advice would you give them to get started? And think about all the diversity with people's background here and people wanting to go to school. And hopefully we're going to have lots of different answers here on how someone can kind of get into this space.
You're regretting going first.
Strategery.
Is it, am I really limited to one word?
No, no.
Okay. Well, I mean, I could say two, four.
No, go longer, please. Please.
A dozen. Don't be afraid to ask questions. You know, one of the nice things about this conference is having young voices present, and for young voices to have the courage not only to stand up and speak, but also to approach and ask questions because they have recognized heritage and are trying to figure out a way to preserve it or to promote it. I don't think I had the presence of mind when I was young to do that. So I think my advice would be, don't hesitate to ask. Don't hesitate to approach.
I'll do four. Mine is join your National Trust. I hope that's a message that reverberates in this room. The National Trust of the World are mostly raising the funding for themselves to look after the heritage that matters so much to you. And they do that on behalf of you. And the way that they do that and the way that they fund that in many, many cases, including here, is by membership. So join the National Trust, become a member, volunteer your time with your National Trust, and think about how you can contribute, starting there.
This is a test. Okay. Well, it's not so much of a test for me because it's something I say all the time as part of our heritage. You and your story is important, and your community is important. You don't have to be, I don't know, somebody local, Marshall, or you're not, it's not that it's somebody high or somebody out there, or that's important. Your story is important. And once you consider your story, your village, your school, your area, whatever is to be told about that is important, then you will value it, and you will try to save it, and you will share it, and it will become, in your mind, that heritage, and that is important. We don't have to teach you that something is heritage or that it's important. You have to learn and gain that sense for yourself. And I'm so sorry, I don't know if the lady from KHAW is here, and I don't want to be too long to get my steel band. But I mentioned to her that I always remember one of the Form 1 students from KHAW coming to the archives. And he was just kind of, looking around all the time. We talking, we giving our lecture, but he was not interested. And then there was a picture of the school, and we were talking about, well, the school used to be in this space before, which was the Forest Princess building, and then they were relocated to the new building. And he immediately perked up and said, but miss, that's my school. And I said, yes. And so he had a story about when he came to school, when he started, but he's young, it's first year. And so I think that's what we need to show them. It's your story, and it's important.
I would say think globally, act locally. And just to add to that point of joining the National Trust, I think we have that programming in Heritage Keepers that does just that, focusing on the local communities. So I think if they start locally, there will be a great impact. There's so much to be done in Trinidad and Tobago alone. I mean, we just chose a few pilot sites, but I wish we could do all 400 and something sites that we have on our inventory, and getting the youth involvement in, they can advocate for the trust. Say, hey, we have stuff in our community we want you to see, and this is why it's important to this generation. There's so much they can do. So I would say think globally, act locally.
Yesterday, I sat and had lunch with the students that were attending because I think just informal conversation is really important, and it's really fun. You know, we talked about where they go to school, what they want to do in life, what do they like to do for fun, what are they concerned about. So I think a big part of keeping history above water and of cultural heritage and climate change is building your network. And, you know, who do you want to talk to? Reach out and talk to them. I guarantee you, people that are doing this for a living want you to reach out to them, and let's go sit on the beach and have a talk. Let's go for a hike. Let's do what you want to do and what you want to know so you can show us what's important to you and what you love. We're just going to pass the mic back and forth.
Yep. Thank you. I would probably draw on my own experience. Having an interest in climate change as a hobby. And I would probably give the same advice I give the young negotiators. Don't try to know everything, because you will never know everything. But identify some area of interest and learn as much as you can about that, because everything else is linked. And the whole picture will form in front of your eyes once you begin to do that, because your horizon will automatically expand. And of course, I endorse the approach of not being afraid to ask questions. I sometimes lecture part-time, and I tell people there are no stupid questions. And all of knowledge starts with one simple sentence: I do not know. And don't be afraid to say that I don't know. So focus on one interest, one aspect of your interest, learn as much about it as possible, read about it, ask questions, and everything else will begin to fall in place, because everything else is linked. Because you can't know everything at the same time or very quickly. You'll never. I'm still learning as well.
Yeah, good point.
I think I'll also start with a very short personal experience. I was at UC Santa Barbara, where I got my master's, and I proudly went to my advisor with my plan for the future of my academic path. I'll take all of these requirements, and I'll get to the next step and the next step, and behold, I'll have my master's degree. And he looked at me, he said, "That is the worst idea I've ever heard of. Because how do you know when you get here that you're gonna like it?" So, you know, you need to find out more, connect more. So my advice to my own students and to young people is, pun intended, immerse yourself into one of these things that you think you're interested in this case, cultural heritage and preservation. Get involved, network. If you ask adults for advice, they can't resist, you know? They'll give you that advice. The other advice I give, especially to my graduate students, is, you know, in my day, I was talking about this last night, I think over our third beer, you know, it was traditional to have a linear career. Mm-hmm. You were studying, I think I used the example of, you're the cockroach expert. You just go on that linear path to go to cockroach conventions, and, you know, that's the future. That's a horrible example, isn't it? But in fact, we're in a new era. Don't be afraid of a non-linear career. Mm-hmm. The problems we have to solve today have to cross disciplines. You have to be able to speak, I think I said this yesterday, across various disciplines, and you need a big tool bag of multidisciplinary experience. And finally, never doubt the power of your young voice. In many cases, it carries much more power than us old white guys, you know. I've watched the dynamics of rooms of politicians change dramatically when a young person gets up to speak. And I've seen great success from that. So young people need that encouragement, and I think we can give it to them.
All right, fantastic. And I just want to encourage, I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open it up to the audience here. And so think about maybe questions that, you know, more than one person can, if they had just some specific thing from President. Let's do something that more than one person could ask, but I'm going to open it up to questions. And I'll just take a quick crack at that myself. And when I think of young people getting into the space, adaptation and climate resilience is just, it's almost everything. National security, urban planning, landscape architecture. My advice is, you know, you can figure out what you like to do, but be fearless. And what's kind of exciting, and this is what I tell people, is that I've been doing adaptation for about 20 years, which makes me ancient in the space. Some people have been only doing it for 2, 3, 5 years. You can actually influence this field. That's what's exciting about it. If people say they know everything about adaptation, they're lying. It's still an emerging sector. People are still figuring things out, how to do it right. And so you can come into this space, if you have some good ideas, and actually be very influential. Imagine you came into urban planning when it first started. That would just be an exciting time. And so that's my advice to you guys. All right, this next question, and then we're going to open up to the audience. And this is, I'm sorry, guys, and I'm going to start, because let's shake things up. Kara, we're going to start in the middle, go down that way, and go back here, just so we don't go down the line. This is self-serving, but I think it'll be useful to people hearing what your advice would be. If you could recommend to me to do a podcast episode around a topic, obviously related to this, that you think deserves more attention, what would it be?
That's like, can I pass it down? Can I hit the pass button? Could you just repeat
So
that?
like I do a podcast,
Yeah.
and like I'm doing Keeping History Above Water. Maybe there's a particular case study that you're working on. Maybe there's an area of climate change that you think doesn't get enough attention, and it's just like I can do a whole episode where we're sharing that story. I'm going to take some notes, and maybe it gets something out. But I think hopefully people will learn about what are some important issues that are happening out there in your space. So.
I guess I would have to say Rudlin's presentation about the built environment, the physical structures. We still don't have a really good understanding. I mean, Rudlin is our one restoration expert in this country. There are a few up and coming, but her wealth of experience over 50 years, I mean, you saw that in the presentation. And I think I would love to focus on the types of buildings, because we have, with the National Trust, when we go out and we do the monitoring of the sites, it's the same issues over and over. People have added concrete to the lime water, so they're having all sorts of water issues, water damages because of, you know, good intentions. They want to fix it, but they're using the wrong materials. So I guess I would say focusing on what the historic materials are and how they should be treated and cared for, particularly in rising waters and, you know, heavier rainfalls and all of the things that she discussed. So I would say that.
Excellent.
You should have warned me, Kara. I had to do homework. There was so much that came out from these discussions, and I'm looking back at some of the notes I took from some of the things people said here, and climate. I thought maybe at first when I was here, climate control, this is climate change. It's not necessarily spot on what I should be involved with, but I think Jay said it, and heritage is about people. And it was longer than that, but that's a part that I wrote down. And I think if we, in the same way I was saying just now that climate control, that I wouldn't necessarily, I keep saying climate control. Climate change is not something that I would have necessarily put nail on. This is what I have a responsibility to treat with. If maybe we make that more, I don't know how to explain it. Make it more something that the people understand. It affects me every way, in every way. As you said, it's every topic. It affects everything about our life. So we need to know that we all have a responsibility and a part to play in making a difference here. So that connection to me was really important in this conference, the variety of ways that people were saying, this is how climate change is affecting us. Yeah, and all these different fields of people. And I think if we talk about that, then people will see how much it affects and it will affect their day-to-day life.
Thank you. I'd be surprised if you don't already have an episode on this. But I think one of the things that's come through for me, listening in the last couple of days, is about loss. It's not about loss as like a possibility in the future, like 20 years from now we might have some things flood and then we should talk about what to do. It's like loss today, here and now. Places are flooding. We are, even if we all stopped using our cars tomorrow and all of us stayed on Trinidad and didn't fly home, we are dealing with a situation where we will lose heritage. How do you manage that? How do you document what's there? How do you think about the future without the things that you have today? And actually, how do you prioritize? Because that's what really interests me. It's always a pragmatic approach. How do you make really difficult decisions about, with a limited budget, no matter where you are, the budget's limited for preservation. So what do you prioritize?
Great.
As I give my response, please watch the reaction of my good colleague and neighbor here. I want you to do a podcast on the role of gaming, virtual reality, and augmented reality, not only as a tool for communicating the importance of preparing and adapting for climate change, but also as a way of exploring the possibility of using technology to help deal with the grief of losing sights.
Awesome. David, we're going to come down to you.
Oh, I'm not done writing my detailed notes. All right, I'm going to indulge myself as maybe the senior member of the panel here. One would be, so I'm going to have two. The first title, still in work, Protecting Cultural Heritage from the Bottom of the Sea. So this unlikely link of overfishing to cultural heritage, overfishing being one of the major contributors to the demise of coral reefs, which I failed to mention yesterday, absorb 97% of wave energy. So very significant. And also nutrient pollution, which I mentioned yesterday, which fuels the growth of algae that covers reefs. So literally what we do in our own backyards and agriculture, all of that emerging from the oceans. The second, hang on, my notes are here somewhere, is that restoration can pay for itself. And that is what I mentioned in my talk yesterday about new economic models using the increasing price of carbon to make possible outside investment into public lands, such as mangrove forests, to restore them and thereby protect cultural resources. And for those outside investors, even to make a profit on their investment, but not ownership of those public resources, just purchasing or investing in the services of those resources.
Awesome.
I'm still working on the titles for you.
Something catchy.
I'll get there. I'll get there.
Okay, thank you. I would like to hear, to bring this to a very personal level, if you can ask people what loss, what permanent loss and damage that you can live with or live without. And what would you like to see retained for your children and grandchildren? And what that would mean in terms of planning for adaptation in the face of adverse climate change impacts.
You two need to brainstorm. You got an outline for me, and we're on it. Yeah, I like this.
I have a lot of work in communities that have been marginalized and underserved, and I have a particular town that, if you want to do a podcast on it, would be an amazing example of equity and justice in climate response. It is an environmental justice issue from the very beginning of the establishment of this town since 1910. It is a climate gentrification issue since this community is on high ground and suffered a Category 5 hurricane. And it is an example of an equitable disaster response.
What's the community?
North Port St. Joe, Florida.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Those are fantastic. So I want to open this up to you guys now, and I will repeat. Come on up to those microphones, and let's ask a question. Okay. Dr. Che, I'm counting on you, okay?
Unfortunately, I'm going to be uncharacteristic, and I want to ask the panel a very dark and hard question. And that is, we've all danced around and tried to end our presentations with hope. But what about death? There is going to be extensive death as a result of these climatic changes. Displacement, migration, overloading, social and infrastructures in society. Are we going to continue to dance around it and not really discuss it because it might be too scary for the public? Or are we going to also include that in the discussion because it really is part of it?
All right, this is not going to be the last question of this panel, so we'll make sure we go some. But I want to check in first with Lisa because we started late, and I'm militant about staying on time unless I'm told we can go over a little bit. We got. Just tell me when, like.
You can have my 4 to 4:15 Q&A.
So 10 extra minutes. All right, I tell you, I stick to these things. All right, who wants to take a crack at that first? We don't necessarily have to go in order, and not everyone has to answer it. So raise your hand. Let's not be shy here. All right, David, all right.
All right. Well, I mean, I already mentioned yesterday, the projections for the oceans are a 70 to 90% coral loss by the end of the century. So we're in a period of triage. There was a study done that showed the 50 most likely areas in the world to still flourish by the end of the century. And so with limited resources, the idea is to focus on those areas to basically repopulate the areas downstream of them in the future when we get climate change under control. When, even though this is a dark question, when we get it under control. But implicit in that is a great, disastrous, heartbreaking death of coral reefs along the way. And I think people have to understand that and realize it and the impacts to the global community. But again, there is hope. 10% of those healthy coral reefs are in Cuban waters. So focusing on those waters and focusing on other island nations to follow some of the examples, some of what has happened there, I think also can be very exciting. But no, I agree. We got to face the dark side.
And not everyone has to answer, but anyone else want to take a crack at that? Okay, please.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll be really quick. I agree with what our colleague said there. We must face it, and I think it helps us in a way to sit up and take note. You know, if you see the reality of it, especially when you all do the simulations and you see the place further out, or we have examples and photos of things that have happened, it helps you to realize the enormity of the problem. But I like that everyone made an effort to show, even if it's in a small way, where the hope is and what we can do, where we can be active and make a difference. And I think that is important. So it's important that we know the reality, but it's also important that we think about the possibilities.
Thank you. I think we're already facing the dark side. It's already here. When I got involved in climate negotiations, people told me, how can you tolerate this thing? Because the progress is so slow at finding solutions, and we haven't found a solution yet. We're still on track for 3 to 4 degrees rise at the end of the century. And it's because I'm the eternal optimist. You have to be. So while we are facing the dark side, the darker side is yet to come, which I think is where the unknown really is and where it gets really scary. My presentation yesterday did say at the end that we will experience loss and damage and permanent inundation of some places. The projections for sea level rise, if we shut off the world, as I said yesterday, will happen because of past emissions. And at the current rate at which climate change is happening, we are actually dealing with a shifting goalpost because we don't know where the temperature will end, where it will eventually settle. You can plan for 1.5 in all optimism, but you don't know exactly where that is going to land at the end of the century. And that range might change in 5 years, depending on what happens in the next 5 to 7 years. So it's about the darker side, I would say.
I'm going to get another question unless someone else wants to weigh in. Okay, let's go over here.
Good evening. Okay. What has been some of the challenges in meeting with communities or participants for focus groups, as in the challenges in shifting mindsets, and what got you personally interested in this field?
Could you repeat the first part of the question, though?
Okay. What has been some challenges in meeting with communities and participants, as in changing their mindsets?
All right. Who wants to take crack first? Come on.
Are we all just?
Yeah, free for all now.
Oh, free for all. Okay.
Well, raise your hand,
Oh.
and I'll see if I can be.
May I please? It's a really good question because I will give an example of working in a community, much like Angela was saying today. Communities that live in water have been through it many, many, many times, and there's a tendency to think, I survived it once, I can survive it again, right? And it's a very long history of pride, in a way, that you live in a place and you know how to shelter in place, and maybe you don't have a choice. So getting through the mindset of these storms or these conditions are going to be exactly the same as they were last time is really, really difficult. Everything is getting stronger, worse levels of rain. It's not going to be the same as it was the last time. So I think that is a really big challenge that we face a lot in working with communities.
But the second part of your question is, how did you get involved in the first place? Was that like part two of that question?
No, it was just to like have an idea of what get people personally involved in this field, because I think it's like an unusual field that people tend to go into.
Right.
So
what's your origins? Like your history, just getting involved with this?
Yeah. So I am an architect, and when I first started working as an architect, I was 21, 22. Honestly, my very first project was working with a community after Hurricane Floyd in 1999. And I didn't even really think about it. I didn't immediately say then, I'm going to work on post-disaster in communities. But then I lived in New York City during Hurricane Sandy, and then I moved to Florida, and it's just, and Hurricane Katrina had hit New Orleans like my first week of graduate school for historic preservation. And you know, you come to the realization that this impacts every single thing that we do.
David?
Something to say? I seem to have something to say a lot. But I'm translating everything into saltwater talk. But I mentioned that one of the most important tools in the tool bag for coastal protection are marine protected areas. And these are important ecologically for the reasons I discussed yesterday. You're protecting the entire ecosystem at once, corals, mangroves, but they're very controversial because nobody wants to be told not to fish. So we realized very early on, nobody wants to listen, once again, to a white guy from Washington, D.C. come down to the islands and tell them, you know, how great MPAs are. So when I was vice president at Ocean Conservancy, we teamed up with Nature Conservancy, and on St. Croix, on St. Croix, we held a fisherman's workshop because there was a proposed marine protected area in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and they weren't going to listen to us, but we brought in fishermen from Mexico, from Colombia, from other countries, their counterparts who had had positive experiences with protected areas, and it became a peer-to-peer conversation. That was powerful. That was a lesson to me in how you can have, in this context, one community come in and talk to another community about their experiences, both positive and negative.
Okay.
Okay, on the first question, the challenge is really getting people to think about the future beyond their present day problems, about something that is abstract, that is going to happen, that is not yet affecting them in the way that they think that it will affect them, and really getting them to think and converse without them telling you their problems now, what they're facing, the problems that they're facing, poverty, whatever. So I think that's the main challenge. But now that we're seeing a change in that going forward, because people are now getting more aware and they're seeing the changes, it's already starting to affect them. On the second question, what got me, I think I answered
How you
that.
even got involved in the climate space? What sort of like your origins of getting involved?
Well, it was not too long ago. Like I said, when I was 22 years old, I was actually doing research. I was a marine chemist, an analytical chemist in my first incarnation, and I was actually doing effects of nutrient and eutrophication on carbon dioxide uptake. And then I was on a fellowship in Bedford Institute of Oceanography in Nova Scotia. And I started to talk to fellow researchers, and there was one guy who was doing carbon dioxide exchange, physical exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean. So I was doing biological uptake, he was doing physical uptake. And so we started to talk, and it was at the same time that the Vienna Convention on ozone depleting substances was being negotiated. And at the same time that I think it was the second climate conference was also being convened. That was 1988 or 89. And being a science buff, I started to read about it, and I got interested. Of course, I changed careers because at the end of the day, no offense to the academics, but I thought, well, all of these papers that you're writing ends up in some journal, no one's going to read it. You put it on your CV, and that's the end of it. And I wanted to make a change, and so I shifted to law and policy, where I could influence policy and really instigate a change in the mindset and the thinking and the practice to really do something meaningful and practical to address the problem.
All right, folks, we have 5 minutes left, and I'm going to try to stick to that, but I also think maybe even the second part I think is really interesting. If anyone else wants to say, how did you get involved in the first place, I think that would be, if anyone who thinks it's a really interesting story, maybe even embellish if you need to, but just nothing exciting.
Divine intervention.
No, my boss said, go here. Okay, I want one last question, and we might not all get to it, okay? And so, sir.
Thank you very much. Good evening, all. This is a question about use of donor funds, reinventing the wheel, and administration using local expertise. Question to Mr. Kumar Singh. Regards to Port of Spain and its overstudy of downtown Port of Spain flooding and so forth, as far as I understand, has there been a lot of studies around the lighthouse, South Key, the Jack Warner study, the IDB study, the Unicode study? So could you give us information about that? Because it seems to be a lot of baseline as far as I remember as a planner. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else willing to take that question? I guess not. Yeah, I think we are one of the more overstudied places. We have all the evidence, all of the facts and the data and the problems are well known. Port of Spain, as you know, is on reclaimed land. So it was reclaimed from the sea. There's a gradual gradient actually from up to by the Queen's Park Savannah to South Key, which is where we are almost. So when rain falls, it comes, and that is why when it rains, only one area floods all the time. So there are solutions that have been proposed. One has been implemented. I'm not sure if an assessment or evaluation has been done to see if it works really good, and that's a pump and the sluice gate at the lighthouse to keep the tide out when it's high and there's periods of high rainfall. So solutions are being implemented. I'm not sure if there was a question on donor funding, and he's left.
Just to confirm, there have been studies
Yeah, they have been studies, and I think some of the recommendations are being implemented. Ah, okay.
Okay, well, we're going to end there, and that's actually pretty good. Here's an example of some on-the-ground examples of adaptation happening, all right? So that's encouraging to hear. I want to thank the panel for participating. For a big panel, I think that you guys great. I appreciate it. Respecting everybody's time. And I want to, again, we're at the end here. Lisa, you're going to kind of come up here, but I want to thank the organizers for allowing me to participate and interview people. And this has been a fantastic event, and you've got a fantastic island here. So, all right. Thanks, guys.
I'll do a quick wrap up. For those who are interested in participating and for the invitations you've been extended either personally or via email and registered, we will be meeting here for the workshop tomorrow at 8:30. We'll be open early, of course, so please join us in the morning. If you would like to talk with some of the folks that are still here and pick their brains while they're here. Kira reminds me that the Turtle Tour, 5 o'clock down in the library, in the lobby. So if you're going on that tour, please meet down there. And I just want to conclude by saying that I am really so pleased that we've got the National Trust, Trinidad and Tobago, the U.S. Ambassador. Didn't we have a great group of people? There were a great group of speakers here. I just want to give everyone a round of applause for their involvement. And I also want to recognize my team members, some of which, we can't always bring everybody. So Haley Maloney did project management, and many of the speakers were talking to her. Fran Haig did all of your travel arrangements for the speakers, and I don't know what I'd do without her. And then obviously Kim Rose is my preservation manager, did a terrific job. Clary, Sujin, Kira, you had such great volunteers. So I want to thank all of the volunteers. I want to thank Crystal. I want to thank Kira, and I also want to thank the people who are going to keep the Resilient Heritage TT website up, going, and available for all of the activities that will be moving on even after this. Because what I have learned in my field and my work is that the hardest job is implementation. And that is where we will be looking at just about anybody in this room to help with that down the road. So again, thank you for joining us for the 9th annual Keeping History Above Water. And I look forward to hopefully coming back another day. Thanks.